As those of you who know me in person may already be aware, I did a thing. I'm now a published scientist. I'm immensely proud and excited by this. It was years of work, of stress, of anxiety and determination, but it's finally here. But it was hard. One of the hardest things I've ever done. Second only to the PhD itself. As a brief disclaimer, I probably titled this video something provocative. Maybe I used words like brutal or referred to the experience as a trial. I want to be clear that while it was absolutely stressful, none of that was due to any of the people involved. My co-authors, the journal staff, the editor, and the reviewers were all lovely and professional throughout. While it can happen that extra stress or pain is caused by the human element in the process itself is exhausting, complex, stressful, and at times an anxiety-fueling nightmare. Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Tufnell, an environmental scientist, and I recently survived the peer review process. During that time, I realized that practically no one who hasn't been through it understands what it is like to do so. I also learned a lot about the process. I want to share my experience, go over the process as I experienced it, step by step, highlighting some of the pitfalls that might await the unwary or unprepared. I'm going to give a few tips as I go along, and I'm going to share with you the things I wish I'd known before I started all of this. Bear in mind, this is largely based on my own experience in my own field, but most of it should be much more broadly applicable. Writing the paper. Now, I'm not going to dwell too long on the actual mechanics of writing a paper, as this would take up far too much time in an already long video. Maybe I'll leave that to its own video. But there are a few things I recommend you consider before you begin. Firstly, which journal do you intend to publish in? This doesn't have to be set in stone. I've known a few people who wrote a paper for one journal, had it rejected, then tweaked it for a different journal and was successfully published there. It does, however, help to know what kind of paper you're writing and what format and style you will need to stick to. Most journals have a template you can use to ensure your paper meets their specifications. Journals will also usually have an advice to authors guide, which I advise you to read thoroughly before you start. You may also want to look at recently published papers in that journal, particularly those from fellow team members or supervisors. This will give you an idea of how your paper needs to be laid out. If you're adapting your paper from your thesis, as I did, the best tip I have is to be prepared to cut down substantially. In a thesis you can, and usually should, expand on ideas and go into as much detail as you want. For a paper, you will need to strip it back to the bare essentials. I needed to cut multiple paragraphs of honestly very interesting background discussion from my paper because it just didn't tie tightly enough into my own research. Every journal will have its own specifications for how references should occur. If you use referencing software, which I suggest you do, particularly for any longer pieces of work, make sure you're familiar with how to set your references style. Most large referencing software options will have a style repository of some sort, and if you're lucky, that repository will include the precise style for the journal you wish to publish in. Failing that, it may have something similar enough, and you will then need to figure out how to tweak the code to do what you need it to. You also need to prepare any supplement for your paper, and you may need to place your data into an accessible repository. If you're not sure which is the most suitable for you, you can check with the journal or someone who's published there recently to see what they used. Co-author approval, round 1. So now you have a paper, and it's as good as you alone and possibly your supervisory team can make it. It's time to reach out to your co-authors. Ideally, by this point, you already know who these need to be. Maybe they headed the project that resulted in the data you're using. Maybe they worked on some of the data. Maybe they were in charge of a data repository or archive that you made extensive use of. If you're not sure who needs to be included, I recommend speaking to your supervisor to see who they recommend. It's also a good idea to include in your message to co-authors something along the lines of, if you think a co-author is missing who should be included, please do let me know, as sometimes people can slip through the cracks. Your message to co-authors needs to include a few things. Many of them may already be familiar with you, but for those who aren't, a brief, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm writing a paper on topic" intro is a good idea. You may wish to include a note on why each co-author is being included so that they know why you're reaching out to them specifically. It probably doesn't need saying, but your message should be concise, polite, and professional. You're asking them if they are happy to be co-authors on this paper. You also need to ask how they wish their names and affiliations to appear on the paper. You need to set a deadline here, otherwise nothing will get done. The convention for how long this should be might vary between countries and disciplines, but I found 4 to 6 weeks was a reasonable time frame. If you're doing this during a busy time of year, giving extra time is advised. A really important thing to include in your message is something to the effect of, "No reply will be taken as complete agreement." This means that you aren't being held hostage by that one co-author who can't or won't reply in a timely manner. Maybe they are sick, on holiday, swamped with work, or in some cases just lazy. Regardless, you're now covered. You should send them your latest draft of the paper. How you do this is up to you. A lot of people prefer to do it in a shareable document that people can edit remotely. This way, everyone can work on the same document, which avoids repetition of feedback and saves you having to merge all the feedback into a single document. This is great in theory, but when I've tried it, I've found some people will edit in the shared folder, some will download it, edit it, then email it to you, and others will see the emailed version and edit that instead. So personally, I just send the document with my opening email rather than faffing about with a shared folder. Either way, you now have to wait till your deadline to get back feedback from most, though usually not all, co-authors. Implementing co-author feedback. No matter how you sent out your draft, odds are you now have multiple versions, each with one or more co-authors' feedback on it. You could manually add all the track changes and comments into a single document. However, both Microsoft Word and LibreOffice Writer have means to merge documents together or combine the track changes from different versions of a document into one. Look up the method for whatever software you are using and merge all those feedback documents into a new feedback-infused monstrosity. Now, I don't know about you, but I always find feedback stressful. You spend months or even years on something only to have it ripped to shreds by somebody else. I can give you a few pieces of advice here. Firstly, take a step back and take a break. It's okay to feel angry, hurt, or upset about feedback. Allow yourself to feel that for a while, then try to let it go. Come back to the document fresh and try to remember that, as uncomfortable a process as this is, it will result in a better manuscript than any individual person could achieve. The question now is what feedback should and should not be implemented. You aren't actually required to do everything your co-authors ask. Sometimes it's just not practical, or there are competing suggestions for a section and you end up going with a different person's suggestion. That said, your co-authors are putting their names and, to varying degrees, their reputations into your paper. It's not unreasonable that they may want tweaks, changes, or sometimes more substantial alterations. Disputes between co-authors can be a serious problem and can cause significant delays. I know of one instance where a dispute over error bars delayed a paper for many months. In my case, no such problem arose. One or two co-authors were particularly generous with their feedback, which took some time and stress to implement, but no one had any serious problems with the paper, so things progressed relatively smoothly. My system for deciding whether to include a co-author's suggestion is to decide whether that suggestion's effect on the paper is positive, neutral, or negative. If the effect is positive or neutral, I almost always implement it. If the effect would be negative, I would refrain from implementing it or find an alternative way to do so, while including a comment explaining precisely why I did it that way. Co-authors are generally quite understanding that not every suggestion can be implemented, but they can feel understandably offended if they think you're just outright ignoring their suggestions. I strongly recommend you create two versions of your latest draft. One is a nice, polished version, the other is a track changes version, which shows what you have changed and where, ideally with comments explaining what was changed and why. This way, co-authors can more easily see what was changed. Get used to this two-document system because you're probably going to need track changes versions a lot going forward. Co-author approval, round 2, and beyond. Now, you've updated the manuscript, and it's time for the next round of co-author feedback. This works much the same as the first round. If the manuscript hasn't needed much revision, you can probably give them less time than previously. 2 to 4 weeks seems to be pretty standard, but again, if this is happening during a particularly busy time of year, give more time. Ideally, you will need 2 rounds of co-author discussions before you're ready to go, but sometimes you will need more. Maybe there's a particularly complex piece of science you're still trying to nail down. Maybe someone's being awkward. Maybe you need to reformat the paper a few times. Either way, once you've implemented feedback and everyone is happy with it, you're ready for the next step. Submitting your paper. There are a few things to know before you do this. First thing is finance. You need to know who will be paying for this paper to be published. If you're publishing in an open access journal, that means the paper will be freely available, but someone will have to cover processing fees. This might come from your grant or your institution. You might choose not to publish in an open access journal, instead choosing a journal that is free to publish in, but the paper will be behind a paywall. You need to know which option you're taking and who will be paying for publication. Assuming you have this sorted, the journal will want a few things from you. You will usually be expected to provide a cover letter of sorts, The journal will tell you what you need to put in, but usually this will include a brief summary of your research, why you think the journal is a good fit for you, and any other related information. Pro tip: if you're adapting your thesis into a paper, it is strongly advised to mention this in your cover letter. Journals usually run similarity or plagiarism checks on submitted work. If your thesis is available online, as many of them are these days, then it could trip that check. Letting the paper know up front means this shouldn't be a problem. On rare occasions, a person might need to embargo their own thesis to ensure it doesn't come out until after their paper, but usually things like this are not necessary. If you are unsure of the journal's policy, I recommend you contact them to find out. Different journals have different policies on AI. So if you used any at any point during your research or the writing of this paper, including research, actual analysis of the data, writing the paper itself, or generating figures, you should double check what the journal's policy is. You will usually need to at least declare your usage. You may need to include a short statement on precisely how you used it, and some journals are now asking you to provide your transcripts. In addition to your cover letter and a copy of your paper, usually in PDF format, you will probably need to provide an abstract and potentially a plain language summary, which can be used to promote your work and avoids overly technical language so as to be more accessible to a broader audience. You may also be asked to recommend a number of referees or reviewers for your paper. Each journal will have different criteria for these, but generally they need to be familiar enough with the topic to be able to review it, but not so close as to have a conflict of interest. Peer review, open discussion. The journal I published with has peer review open to everyone. That means the preprint version of the paper is visible to the public, as are reviewer or community comments. Yes, community comments. Provided someone has an account with the journal, they can post comments in response to your preprint. I did not have this happen for me, but one person did privately contact me to provide feedback and praise, which was really nice. While this will vary between journals, the open discussion phase lasted about 6 weeks for me, but was extended to 7 weeks when one reviewer missed the deadline to review. Reviewers are anonymous, at least at this stage, so I have no way to know what happened, but nothing could proceed until they did review it, as a minimum number of reviews must be done before the paper can be accepted. This phase is where I ran into a slight problem. The journal encourages authors to reply as quickly as possible in order to stimulate discussion, but your author reply should be run by your co-authors before you submit it, which takes time. I would suggest it's best to err on the side of caution and wait until all reviewers are in before drafting replies and sending them to co-authors for approval. If you're unsure of the etiquette here in your field, check with your supervisor or someone who has recently published in that journal. Reviewer feedback and author reply. How long you have for this stage will vary, but 4 to 8 weeks seems to be pretty common. If you think you may need longer, contact the journal staff and request an extension. I needed to do this as I got to this stage mid-December and knew that none of my co-authors would be able to get back to me for at least a month. Probably quite a bit longer than that, due to the festive period and New Year's breaks. You now have 2 tasks. Firstly is to formulate an author reply to the reviewer feedback. And by this, I don't mean you can just say, "Thanks for reviewing," and call it a day. Reviewers will usually have a detailed list of things they want corrected, clarified, or otherwise revised. Your reply will need to answer these point for point. You will need to send a document with the reviewer comments and your replies in it to your co-authors for approval. Bear in mind that if you are doing open discussion peer review, your author reply will not only be visible to all, but will actually have its own digital object identifier, or DOI. This can be a problem because if you post in error, the journal can't delete it. You will need to post an additional comment clarifying or correcting your earlier one. The second task is to address and, where appropriate, implement feedback from the reviewer into the paper. Do this in track changes because the journal is likely to want a track changes version so that the reviewers can see what you have changed in response to their feedback. As with co-author feedback, you don't have to do everything a reviewer asks, but if you choose not to do something they have requested, you will need to give a detailed and convincing reason as to why. For my paper, the first reviewer largely asked for some formatting changes to my manuscript to make it flow better. They also wanted better signposting, again for ease of reading. The second reviewer wanted a little more background detail in order to set up the research in its proper context. They also had a few technical questions that required me to add some clarifications to the paper. Your reviewer's feedback may be extensive or fairly minor. Either way, you will need to address all of it before you can proceed. Once you have revised your manuscript, send it to your co-authors for approval. As with all steps involving co-authors, make sure to give them a deadline to get back to you by, and ensure that you still have time to action any of your co-authors' feedback. I mentioned in the last section receiving feedback privately. This actually prompted me to update a figure in my paper. It didn't change the data, just added an additional y-axis to make the figure easier for the reader to pass. Because that wasn't requested by a reviewer, though, a co-author advised me to mention this addition to the editor when I submitted the revised manuscript. This avoids the appearance of sneaking something into the paper that might change it. Once both tasks are complete, you're ready to submit the relevant documents. For author replies, you may need to do this twice. You will need to reply directly to the reviewer comments on your paper. The journal I published with also required a copy of my point-for-point reply to be submitted in PDF format, along with the PDFs of the revised manuscript, including a polished copy and a track changes copy. Further revisions. One thing I did not realise is that it's actually quite normal to have multiple rounds of reviewer feedback. Thankfully, a friend warned me this was a possibility, so I wouldn't freak out discovering I'd need to go through another round of revisions. This can happen for a number of reasons. For example, the reviewers may feel you haven't fully actioned their feedback, or that your revisions add further questions that need to be addressed. Luckily for me, my reviewers were happy with my revisions, so I progressed to the next round of revisions. This time requested by the editor, who had requested some clarifications on how uncertainties were calculated. When an editor asks for clarifications like this, you really do need to implement them, as it is assumed you weren't quite clear enough originally. Ideally, clarifications will have been requested and added at an earlier stage, but sometimes they can be missed, and a good editor can catch them. I was given 10 days to do these revisions, but due to ill health, requested an extension. Once you complete the next round of revisions, you can submit them in the requested format. Up until this point, files are usually required in PDF format, but for the final stages, in addition to the PDF version of your manuscript, you will also need to submit a Word document, and usually a zip file with your figures. The journal's typesetting staff will then get to work reformatting everything into its final form. Proofreading. Assuming you've passed the previous stages, your paper will be approved for publication. But your trials are not quite over yet. There is still the proofreading stage. I underestimated this. I assumed it would be a fairly minor spelling, punctuation, and grammar corrections. It was a little more involved than that. They may request tweaks to your figures. For example, one friend of mine needed to tweak a figure because one bar out of several was just slightly thinner than the others. As the proofreaders are generally not experts in your field, you will need to proofread their work carefully in case they accidentally correct a word or phrase and thus change its meaning. This is becoming even more important as more and more journals have started using AI as part of their editing and proofreading processes. I highly recommend you thoroughly proofread any proof copy you are sent every time you're sent one. Every word, including author names, title, and references. Include not just areas you know have been altered, because AI changes may not be flagged as track changes. As time-consuming as this is, you do not want to discover after the paper is published that an AI hallucination changed your name to something utterly different, or replaced some key word with the Latin name for a random species of fish. These are all things I've heard are happening to people's papers. Due to the way the document is formatted, tables and figures can be moved to odd places in the manuscript. It can be difficult to correct this, but if they're in totally inappropriate locations, it can be worth requesting they be moved. When I got my proofreading copy, it contained 62 typesetter comments. I do not know what the normal number of such comments are, but I had not expected so many. Fortunately, they were all pretty minor things. For example, they wanted to confirm how co-author names should appear, remove references from the reference list that didn't appear in the paper, and add ISBNs or DOIs to references that lacked them. My referencing software had caused some minor errors to creep in, and the proofreaders helpfully identified them. I was given 2 months to complete this, though I completed this in less than 2 weeks. Honestly, if I had been in a rush, it could have been done in a day, but I prefer to take my time and be meticulous. I submitted an annotated PDF and a document where I replied to all the typesetter comments and added any requests or queries of my own. I didn't, strictly speaking, need to include both, but I wanted to be thorough. Shortly after, I received a proof copy and a track changes copy in which the feedback I gave in the last document had been implemented. The procedure was much the same, and after a thorough proofread, I approved it. The final step after that was being sent the final version of the manuscript. I needed to give approval for it to be published. I can't imagine many people get this far only to withdraw their paper, but I suspect for legal reasons, the journal still needs approval to proceed. Published. Once all these steps are done, all you should need to do is wait. In my case, my paper was published the day after I approved it, but timings will vary. These days, most journals are either entirely digital or largely digital, so you don't usually need to wait for the next edition to come out for your paper to make its debut. I submitted my paper on the 7th of October 2025, and it was published on the 8th of April 2026. So the entire thing took almost precisely 6 months, not counting the original writing of the paper or the rounds of co-author feedback. If you're lucky, you could probably shave a month or two off that, and if you're unlucky, you might need considerably longer. From what I've seen in my own field, papers taking somewhere between 6 months and a year seems pretty standard. Conclusion. So I really hope you enjoyed this rather long video on how the process of peer review actually works. I also hope that you found it useful and informative, whether you're planning to submit a paper of your own, good luck by the way, or because you have a friend or family member who's working on a paper right now and you want to know why they appear to be having a mental breakdown. If you did find this interesting, I encourage you to subscribe so that you can hear about new videos I put out. Please let the algorithm know you liked the video by commenting, liking, and sharing with anyone you think might find it interesting. So until next time, thank you for watching.